Thank you very much, everybody, for coming along, attending this webinar. I'd like to acknowledge that we are meeting on the land of the Bryah, the people of the Gunai Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. A little bit of housekeeping, although we are a small group this evening, it would be great if you're not speaking to remain on mute, and obviously you can turn your cameras off as well. There will be an opportunity to ask questions in our Q&A section after our presentation. And if you wish, you're more than welcome to type them in the chat function as well. If you don't wish to speak, that's fine. Okay, this is our fourth community webinar, which is being recorded so we can share our insights with other communities wanting to undertake a similar project to MyTown Microgrid feasibility study. Tonight we will be concentrating on the data being collected by the Wattwatchers monitors that have been installed throughout Heyfield. I'd like to introduce our speaker for this evening, Tim McCoy, Program Manager at Program Manager at Wattwatchers. Tim, as I said, is Program Manager at Wattwatchers and has been so for 15 years. He has, 15 years of experience as People and Technology Leader in the energy and utilities industry. Tim has had a career with both local and international companies focusing on the commercialisation of the Internet of Things, energy management, and metering solutions in Australia, New Zealand, and parts of Southeast Asia. Tim has been with the MyTown Microgrid project for the last 2 years, looking after the installation of Wattwatchers devices in Heyfield, as well as working with all the project partners to deliver a successful project. Born in Melbourne, he has in fact spent most of his school years in Gippsland. So, lucky fella. Glad to have you here, Tim. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Emma. Just checking you can hear me okay?
Yes.
No problem. Thank you. I'd like to acknowledge this evening that I'm actually speaking from the land of the Boonwurrung peoples on the outskirts of eastern Melbourne, and I pay my respect to their elders past, present, and emerging as well. So thank you for having me. I'm a reasonably familiar face amongst the Heyfield CRG and the project team, but thought it would be best for the audio to present from home tonight. And so those who watch tonight, and indeed those who watch it after the event, can get the best out of the session. So this being part of our community webinar series, we'll be taking a look at some of the data and the insights from the Wattwatchers energy monitoring devices that are installed, not just in Heyfield, but in the region immediately around Heyfield, and show a bit of the data journey from my home to MyTown, as we call it. I'd also like to thank and acknowledge our other project partners that are all part of bringing together this data and this insights that are making it a successful project, as much of a successful project as possible. So just to recap, the MyTown Microgrid project is a 3-year project that runs until the middle of next year. So we're just over that 2-year mark completed. It has $1.8 million of federal and state grant funding. The predominant funder is from the Regional and Remote Communities Reliability Fund for Microgrids, RCRF to those of us in the industry, and the Latrobe Valley Authority. So it is a data-led feasibility study to explore the potential for a Heyfield microgrid or other energy solutions that will take us on the journey to a microgrid for Heyfield and the broader Heyfield community. And as Emma mentioned, one of the most important parts of the project is ensuring that we share these learnings with the Heyfield community and other communities who are looking to undertake a similar journey in working on their renewable energy future. So you might recognise a few of these facts if you live or work in Heyfield. We've used some of the slides and information that we're currently sharing on our community dashboards. These are screens that are displayed currently in the resource centre and at the post office, but we've obviously made quite a few tweaks and showing a lot more data this evening. So from what we've gathered, Heyfield is actually using 17 gigawatt hours of electricity a year, which is enough to power 3,000 homes. But it's important to sort of pause on that and realise that Heyfield's actually only a township of about 1,000 homes and a lot more businesses. So what is driving that usage that makes you look like more than 3 times the size that you actually are? It's fairly simple. There's a very large chunk of industrial load from some of the manufacturing facilities around and in Heyfield. So residential makes up about 30% of the load. The commercial makes up about another 20%. And then you can see the very large chunk of industrial. but all of that energy, it's about enough to make 113 million cups of tea, which we thought was a good measure. So it's certainly a lot of boils of the kettle. But going a little bit deeper, so we start this journey of my data where the project's capturing obviously lots of energy data. We've deployed 98 of our smart energy monitoring devices now, and these are covering about 75 homes and businesses and the schools within Heyfield and the area around it. The project also has additional data from the local electricity network from AusNet and some extra data from the industrial sites. In the bottom left corner, you'll see the little pictures of the orange and black devices. They're the small energy monitoring devices that are installed in our participants' switchboards. And then a couple of the charts that we're going to show a lot more examples of over the next 20, 30 minutes or so, shows you how we bring that data together. And of course, a shout out and a wave to Emma who's in the room. And I think Brenton's on the line, Brenton's actually looked after all the installs that we've done across over the last, it's hard to believe, the last 18 months or so. So in my home, our project participants have been using the Wattwatchers Energy app, the My Energy app, to monitor and understand their energy usage. They've been able to use the main features of the app to see their energy usage in real time and actually look and see how much their solar is using, how much of that energy is being used within the house, and how much of it is either going back out to the grid or how much extra energy they need to pull in from the grid. The app actually updates every 5 seconds. So it does mean that people have been able to run around their homes, turn the kettle on and off, turn the air conditioning, other appliances on and off, and see those changes in real time to get a chance to understand how their energy is actually consumed instead of just getting one big bill at the end of the month. The app has a number of features. Obviously, extra graphs and charts are there. In the middle, the orange screenshot is just showing that you can actually upload a retail bill, which gives you a nice simple way of getting a quick view of, is there a better retail plan that's available for me? And even more importantly, our notifications feature was only launched about 3 or 4 months ago, which means you don't even need to be logged into the app or have the app open rather. You'll get push notifications about your budget. Are you using more energy or less energy than the budget target that you've set? And it's a great way to sort of take your mind off your energy, but know that you'll actually get a little pop-up notification on the home screen of your phone if you suddenly start going over that daily or monthly or weekly budget. Our participants have also given us some fantastic feedback. So we had one in particular who said, since the devices were first installed, they've replaced 2 of their major appliances, a fridge and an air conditioner, and that both of those units showed a marked decrease in the power usage in the energy monitoring app. And the reason for that is the device is installed in the switchboard. It's a behind the meter solution, if you hear that term thrown around. And we are actually measuring the individual circuits in the house instead of what a normal smart meter does, which is just measure everything that's coming in and out of the house. That means that we're actually measuring what the hot water system is doing, what the air conditioning may be doing, or the lighting, or the pool pumps, or whatever is in the house. We're actually measuring some of the individual circuits, particularly the major ones, which gives you that really powerful information to understand where your energy is going instead of just one big bill at the end of the month or the quarter and not really understanding, well, how much of that was my air conditioning? How much was hot water? And can I do anything about it? So it's been some great feedback from one of this, that actually participant was one of our CRG members. It's been great to hear that. And we've heard a lot of similar positive messaging back from our community as well. But the people who live in Heyfield, there's lots of families that also send their children to the schools. So we have also got energy monitoring installed at the 2 schools in Heyfield. Now on the left, we've got one of the schools has solar, and on the right is the school that does not have solar. And there's all sorts of reasons why different buildings and businesses and homes can and can't have solar. So just in isolation to talk about what you'll see here is there's more excess solar, obviously, in December to February, in those summer months when the sun is shining a lot more than particularly winter. And you can see that the dark orange section is that we obviously are sending a lot more of that excess solar to grid. But of course, December and January also correlates with the school holidays, but we'll touch on that more in a moment. The second thing to note is that in the bottom half of that screen, there's a different way of displaying the data. These dashboards come from our partner solar schools. The darker the green, the stronger, the more solar that was generated on that day. And the bottom of that chart is actually February, and it goes, each row higher is February, March, the progressive months through this year. And you'll just notice if you look at it generally that the dark green's at the bottom, and it generally gets a bit lighter in the middle, obviously around winter. And you start to see some very dark greens appear again in September, because these are the fantastic transition months when the temperatures are low. We've had some beautiful sunny days, and those are ideal solar producing conditions, coupled with the holidays are also occur in that same period. On the other side of that screen, to show the school that doesn't have solar, we actually see a whole bunch of different trends. So as you'd expect, the winter energy consumption is much higher in that sort of June to September period across the winter months to heat the school and keep everybody warm. So that's quite obvious. The other thing that's also noticeable is whereas in the last chart of green squares that showed us solar production, the grey squares are actually telling us the darker the grey, the more energy that was used on that day. And if you look carefully, you'll start to sort of see those patterns in that there are blocks of days that are grey, darker greys, some getting darker than others, and suddenly you have 2 light grey days. That's simply the weekend. And you can start to identify the rhythm of the school, being obviously kids at school Monday to Friday. You get groups of dark grey, 2 days of light grey, the weekend not much happening, and that repeats over and over. And it does also mean the long stretches of light grey are actually the school holidays. And these are ways we can use the data to check that air conditioning or heating, something hasn't been left on at the school during the holidays, and get a sense of, yes, the usage pattern means that all the usage is happening when the children are at school, and then when no one's at the school, there's not a huge amount of energy being used. But the individual schools, as I said a little earlier, there's many reasons why you can and you can't have solar. And it's our ability to use all of that benefit together and actually put the 2 schools together and show that as an aggregate of the 2 schools, there's not quite enough solar on the one school to sort of run both schools during the day. However, on the weekend, it is quite clear the yellow bits of the chart is excess solar that's being just sent into the grid, into the community on the weekend. So that's good news in that the solar system and the load is balanced quite well. Of course, if you could have more solar, you might cover those days where the usage is high. But the important point to make here is there is excess solar that's available to do something with in the community on the weekends. If you look on the far right side, we've got those usage and generation numbers that have been appearing on these charts. In this case, it's sort of appropriate to say that the school is about 50% renewable, the schools combined rather. So there is quite an amount of solar that's being generated, and their renewability index, no, it's not 100%, but is substantially on the way, even just with the 2 schools, a fairly small sample. And Emma, just checking, I'm still coming through clean?
Yep.
Thank you, Emma, no problem.
Sorry, I was on mute.
I did see your nod, thank you.
Yeah, one thing, Tim, did you want to get your laser pointer?
Yes, I will get the pointer going, just in case we need it. Thank you. Of all the families who obviously have got monitoring in their home, the school, the children are at school, obviously then if you're living and you may be working or at least using the businesses in the community, the supermarket, the hotels, the bakery, whatever those are, when we put those businesses together, there's also a lot of solar on the main group of businesses in the town. And what we can see with that profile is, pardon me while I just get my animations going, there is a natural rhythm every single day where obviously the key business hours are basically 8 a.m. till 6 p.m. Obviously there's some businesses that have much longer business hours, but in essence you get a lovely up and down each day with the rhythm of the business day. But there are days where we have excess solar that is being sent into the community, and we could perhaps do even more with that solar energy. And it's also worth noting there, whilst the usage is fairly consistent when you average it out Monday to Friday, the 23rd of September, so most of these charts you've been seeing tonight are just a week in September from just a week ago. But I'd point out that you can see this area is a day where it was overcast or raining. That was the grand final holiday, if I've got my my days correct, but it wasn't the best solar production day. So there are days where we have excess solar and there are days when we don't. But of course, the businesses altogether do use a lot of energy, and we're somewhere less than, you know, maybe 30% renewable when we look across all of the aggregated data for the businesses. The other type of business, so once we've talked a lot about Heyfield, the township itself. When we step out into the broader community, there's obviously Heyfield is surrounded by lovely farmland. And this is the example of a dairy farm, to look at something quite different, where the blue is again the usage and the yellow is the solar generation. But you'll notice that basically every day, most of the solar is falling when there's no load or not much load at these sites. And that is quite typical of a dairy farm, because milking early in the morning and late in the afternoon or evening, and the solar is obviously going to peak in the middle of the day. So for that site, most of that solar is just, the excess solar is going into the grid to other people in the community. Or it could be stored on site, or something could be done with that energy. But it's worth pointing out, different businesses have different profiles, and farming has the unfortunate profile that is misaligned, or this type of farming, rather dairy, that's most misaligned with the solar. Not that you can't do anything about that. The other thing that's in Heyfield is wonderful community facilities, and I'm talking about the library, the hall, the Wetlands Information Centre, and the Resource Centre, to give a few examples, and the museums. Most of those buildings have solar, and we're measuring most of the solar, and as you can see, there is a huge amount of excess solar that's being sent out into the community. And the reason for that simple is a lot of these buildings either have low use or aren't being used during the day. But if I think, Emma, if you're at the Resource Centre, that's always occupied, but the wetlands is probably used at odd days or for evening events. And these usage pattern means you've got these facilities that are soaking up the sun and sending that excess energy into the community anyway. Would point out that the community facilities, when you group them together, are a lot more than 100% renewable. There's something in the order of 24 times renewable in terms of their usage. So gives you an example of the solar systems aren't not doing anything. They are absolutely helping balance that renewable equation for the people in the town, or the businesses in town that might not actually have solar. But yes, it's quite a lot more solar than their normal consumption. So now we've been through the home, the businesses, the schools, the farms, and the community buildings themselves, and we step all the way through to MyTown, to the town level view. And about 65% of our devices are installed within the Heyfield town boundaries, and the remaining 35% are installed in quite a lot of different places right around Heyfield, Denison, Cower, Seaton, up around to Glenmaggie. And the reason for that is we wanted to make sure we had data right around the greater Heyfield region while we looked at what the boundaries of a microgrid or potential community energy solution would look like. So the main cluster being in the town, but we've had some excellent data coming from all types of different customers right around the greater Heyfield region. When we bring the data from all of the energy monitors together, this starts to be the final picture. In that, what is most important to point out here, the blue line is everybody's consumption added up together. And again, you can see roughly that wave pattern of everyone busy in the day and asleep at night, and that just goes on and on and on. The green line is everybody's solar, all the businesses and all the homes that were monitored, all the solar in the Heyfield community added up. And you'll notice that, particularly in September at the moment, on most days, there's more solar than there is consumption, and there is excess solar. So there is excess energy that's available to the community, that could be used or stored for later use. Now, something I wanted to make an important point for tonight is that remember that none of this solar energy is going to waste, and the solar energy is already being shared within the community. If you're not using the solar at your own property, that under most circumstances, unless you're export limited, a topic for another night, I think we probably have talked about that in one of our webinars. But in simple terms, any of the solar that's generated that you don't use within your own property or business is simply sent into the grid, and that could be used by your neighbour who might turn on a kettle or a light bulb or whatever it is that uses that energy. So already everyone is sharing their excess solar, but they're not doing it in a way that is acting as a whole kind of single community, which basically needs at the moment a single retailer or a single solution to wrap that all together. Everyone is just selling their excess solar to the grid, and basically somebody else is purchasing that at their normal rate. It's all sort of hidden. The other point to make is there are no green electrons or blue electrons. There are simply electrons in the grid. So the energy in the grid will simply flow to whoever needs it. It doesn't matter whether it's from solar or from coal. But when we actually measure all this energy and everybody's solar generation combined, it's clear there is excess energy in Heyfield that perhaps we could be putting in a community battery or doing something else with. The final chart I wanted to show you tonight was this is a breakdown of the energy consumption in September by hour of the day. But it starts to show us some really interesting features very quickly. So peak solar generation is pretty much in the middle of the day, as you'd expect. It's subtle in this chart, and if we've looked at other times in the year, sometimes it's been more obvious, but there's a little subtle dip in the total consumption of the energy consumption of the town at about 12 o'clock in the day that corresponds with the maximum solar output. Interestingly, the daily peak at the moment is something around 2 to 3 o'clock in the day, which is a little bit earlier than we normally think. And there are some interesting influences of the solar maximizes at 12, 1 o'clock, but by 2 o'clock, everyone's solar is actually starting to drop off. Still producing a lot of energy, but it's certainly not at its maximum. If you think of all those bell curves that we were looking at before, it's dropping off the end of that bell curve. So you start to see some interesting things. The load increases on the system at 2 and 3 o'clock in the afternoon as everyone keeps using energy, but the solar energy is starting to roll off for the day. Then the more traditional peak that we talk about at 6 o'clock is still less than the daily peak. It's an interesting result. But basically everyone's come home, they're cooking dinner, they're putting on loads of washing, perhaps putting on heating and cooling. Being September, it's probably mostly heating, but there is a noticeable increase at 6 o'clock in the evening. And then there's a gentle decline through the end of the evening as everyone starts settling in to watch Netflix and whatever it is they do for the evening to relax. But the big event is a sudden increase in load at about 11 o'clock at night, and that's simply driven by everyone's hot water system turning on. And this is where all of these concepts start coming together, because we get an evening peak driven by hot water. Everyone's hot water system is pretty much at temperature by 4 a.m. So the lowest usage on the grid is at 4 a.m. And that's been very consistent across all of our data. 3 a.m., 4 a.m. hasn't moved much. But there's this whole period of the night, if you will, from 11 p.m. till 4 a.m., where we've essentially got flexible load. And in looking at the concepts around a microgrid or a community energy solution, this flexible load is all about, can we move the hot water to a different time of the day that actually makes it more useful, or to soak up that excess solar energy to maximize the renewable energy, the use of the renewable energy rather. One last view that I wanted to go over this evening was just to show you a bit of a greenhouse view that we've put together on the same data. So the commercial, looking at the pie chart, the commercial greenhouse generation obviously dwarfs the residential and the school. This is just data for sort of small and medium businesses. It's excluding any industrial and manufacturing activity in and around Heyfield. But there are some interesting points to look at from a net zero perspective, where on certain days, you'll remember that the 22nd was the public holiday for the day of mourning for the passing of the Queen, and the 24th and 25th were actually the weekend that followed. And on those days, the people were obviously out of home doing interesting things, enjoying their days off. And the school and the residential were actually exporting more energy, more green energy, and thus they were a negative contribution to CO2. So while the businesses were running and still had their solar, it was actually the homes and the school that were basically taking away that greenhouse contribution. They were offsetting the greenhouse gas emissions of the businesses. And it's the same on the weekend. But interestingly, when people are back at home, it looks like people might have been home on the 23rd, and the 21st is probably a regular day. There are certain days where, depending on the conditions and public holidays and weekends, that suddenly that equation flips around and everybody's vacant homes that has solar, they're offsetting the greenhouse emissions of people who don't have solar or the businesses that might be operating that day. So to start to wrap up this evening, we wanted just to talk about some of these buzzwords and what we're working on as we start to close out the end of the project, and these microgrid and local energy solutions. So the first one you've heard me mention a couple of times is a community battery. And a community battery, in very, very general terms, is shipping container size storage. It might be one half container, a 20-foot container. It might be one or a number of 40-foot containers, which gives you something in the order of 0.5 megawatts to a few megawatts of storage. And again, for simplicity tonight, I'm not getting into the detail of megawatts and megawatt hours, more to give you a picture of community battery is probably something small to large shipping container in size. The intent of a community battery is usually you would have one, not that that's a particular restriction, but a central battery for the community where everyone's excess solar energy can go into during the day, and then the energy in that battery can be used in the evening peak to either help everyone cook their dinner with the greenest energy possible, or perhaps be used even later to offset when everyone's hot water starts coming on. So the hot water is charged, if you will, from green energy. The other term you'll have heard used is neighborhood batteries. And these are fridge-sized cabinets, large fridges admittedly, but roadside cabinets, typically giving somewhere from 100 kilowatts, so 0.1 megawatts, to maybe 0.5 megawatt of storage. Neighborhood batteries, the model is essentially that you may put them actually up the poles, and indeed there are some projects here in Melbourne and other places about putting neighborhood batteries on power poles, but they can be mounted on the ground, and you would put a number of those neighborhood batteries perhaps around Heyfield to soak up the energy locally and then send that energy back out locally. And so it's a smaller footprint, easier to install, gives a little bit more flexibility, and they can be deployed exactly where they need to be in the network, perhaps with less cost because you can sort of put them into the existing infrastructure. Load flexibility, I've mentioned a couple of times this evening, and that's really about moving things like the hot water and more from overnight or times of the day when it might not be optimal to run it if you've got excess solar in the middle of the day, which we clearly do as a community. Community retailers, now it's been a really, really tough 6 months with the energy crisis, which suddenly seems to have gone quiet and somewhat abated. But the honest outcome is, yes, some of those community retailers have closed down, but others have continued to operate and have just focused elsewhere temporarily. So the option to look at a community retailer still exists and is very much in our minds in the project. And an aggregator is another word, maybe not as familiar to some, where you actually need somebody who can monitor and control and look after all of those hot water systems or whatever that load that's being controlled, so that an aggregator is responsible for coordinating it and managing, knowing when there's excess generation, when's a good time to use that storage, and when's a good time to move that flexible load. So these are the themes that the research team is still looking into these closing few months of the project to the end of the year. before we start to present our final findings early next year. And then to zoom out a little bit, I wanted to close out, and thanks to Murray for helping guide me with including some of these. We wanted to include some information on the macro trends, the big things happening in the energy grid at the moment. The two big buzzwords, of course, being decarbonisation and electrification is certainly the word of the year, I think, in the energy industry. Decarbonisation has been around for a while. We're probably more familiar with it. Obviously, there's further retirements and the performance decline of the coal fleet. We were talking just before the webinar started about how only this week we've had the news that AGL will be closing Loy Yang A about 10 years ahead of schedule. And so the closure and retirement of coal plants will only continue and to accelerate over the next 10, 20 years. That's of course being offset by an increased penetration in renewables, which wind, solar, and other types of energy, but it comes with its own challenges. Whilst we're also building up new large-scale projects, the offshore wind projects, it may not be long before just off the coast of Gippsland we'll see the spinning tips of turbines out in the waves. But new large-scale projects are happening in terms of wind and storage and the transmission infrastructure that goes with that. Electrification, on the other hand, there's a lot more of that's in the hands of the individual consumer. For example, degasification is the other buzzword at the moment, which is essentially switching from gas appliances to high efficiency electric ones. Examples of that might be removing your gas cooktop and switching over to an induction electric cooktop, or switching from gas hot water to a heat pump as examples. Electric vehicles continue to accelerate, pun intended. They're becoming much more affordable. It's wonderful to see that while they might have been a luxury item over the last 5 or so years, costing 70,000 and potentially in excess of 100,000, this next year and even now, there are EVs on the market that are in the $40,000 to $50,000 bracket. Still not yet as affordable as a basic car, but they're much more affordable, and the options and the types are becoming even wider. And I think another important trend to watch out is in the US, in particular, the Rivian and the Ford F1 Lightning are two very large footprint utility vehicles, which are a very important part of the Australian Australian culture, our ability to throw a bale of hail in the back of the ute or whatever needs to be. So we're no longer just bound to sleek city electric vehicles. All of the different EV options are going to be coming available over the next couple of years, coupled with more fast charging infrastructure. So I hope I get this right, Emma. We know the fast charging's gone into Yarram and is in the middle of going into the Port of Sale. And we're expecting that Heyfield's fast EV charger will be ready April, May next year, Emma?
That's what the notice says out in the car park opposite the pub, that's when it's going to be there. They're already installed in the Port of Sale. There's fast chargers down there. And I mean, the car park, the centre in Trowden's had EV charging there for a very long time, for at least a year or so. Yeah.
So those options are rapidly increasing, and will be a big part of a shift away from fossil fuel sources. Won't talk too long about demand response. Flexibility has been a huge theme through tonight's presentation about moving, but it does change the focus on when electricity is used rather than exactly on how much, because we're starting to get periods of excess generation, which is the case of solar and the case of wind, and it can be much more beneficial to turn things on like hot water and charge a hot water system, if you will, when there's excess renewable energy available. This coupled with local storage options, community batteries, neighbourhood batteries, and of course today, quite accessible, there are options for batteries for homes and businesses, but coupled with biomass, alternative generation like biomass can be things like, could be burning sawdust, it could be burning the agricultural waste products as well. And combined with rooftop solar means we're only able to increase the renewable energy mix locally with more and more options. So that was a lot of data. It actually was probably a bit of a shorter webinar than some of the others we've run. We were hoping there'd be a few interesting questions. You're welcome to now ask those via the chat. put your hand up and we'll keep an eye out for you. But yeah, thank you. And at this point, I'd open the floor to see if there is any other questions.
Hello. I'm quiet. Has anybody got any questions they'd like to start off with? Maureen, you came along because you wanted to know a little bit more about your monitor.
Yeah.
What was happening? Did you want to talk about that at all?
Oh, I've got a battery, and we just don't know how much our solar is going into the battery, and then so when we're away on holidays, we turn our hot water service off. And so does that just fill up the battery? And then we don't really understand the battery very well.
So yes, it's probably good that Emma and I maybe have a chat to you offline and go through your data and see what we can see. In our case with the project and the Wattwatchers devices, we can't see, we're not talking to the battery, we're not communicating directly with the battery. So the one thing we can't see is state of charge to know when it's discharging or charging. But what we can see is if the energy is going from the solar is going somewhere, or if it's going into the battery, or if that excess energy is going out to grid. It's hard to know what to do. If you're away and the house is not using much energy, chances are you're spilling most of your solar energy back out into the grid. So the house might be running off the battery overnight if it's working how most are configured. But it wouldn't I wouldn't think all of the battery overnight if you're not home. And then in the morning, it tops back up for an hour or two from the solar, and then all your excess solar would just be going into the community. So I think you're on the right journey, and switching those things off that you don't need when you're not in the property is a great way to go. But it sounds like we need to have a closer look with the data and try to help you a bit further. So yes, it's hard to say, but in general sense, I'd expect that your battery might only be discharging a little bit, but sending most of that excess energy into the community, if you will.
Yes.
We can certainly arrange that.
Yeah,
so you can,
yeah.
get a bit more visibility of what your battery and your solar are doing.
Yeah, yeah.
All right, thank you for that.
So, Tim, could I ask a question?
Of course, Mike.
I was just wondering at the moment, so, we're talking about heating hot water off peak, but at night, how does the cost of that compare to switching it to heat using the solar, but doing it during the day? So at the moment, I would imagine it would still be a lot more expensive to heat during the day.
It would, and so these are the very questions that the project team is modelling at the moment. So yes, it's quite theoretically simple to move that energy from night to day, but even electrically reconfiguring switchboards, and it may not even be to a smart meter. There's a cost to reconfigure it, physically with the circuits. But the whole point would be to say, but if we've got excess solar energy, aren't we better off using that within the community to offset those other issues? And more and more people within the energy industry are realizing that, look, there is an incredible resource installed at most people's properties if they've got electric storage, hot water, that represents an existing battery, right? So it is a delicate balance of trying to find the right amount of that load to shift so that there's no cost impact to users. In fact, the whole point is to try to use as much of the free or the low cost solar energy as possible. But that's very much the modeling we're doing at the moment too. One of the project team is modeling using the Wattwatchers data to model the average Heyfield customer. So we're using a few customers aggregated together to say, here's what they use and here's how much their hot water uses. And then they're scaling that up to say, how does that look at the Heyfield scale, and what is the cost, benefits, and the cost to implement that load flexibility. So that's very much the option we're looking at in much more detail.
So if I've got excess solar at the moment and I was to heat my water during the day, for example, I mean, I've got heat pumps, so it doesn't sort of make that much difference. But I would use my solar excess first before I start drawing on the grid, wouldn't I, during the day?
Yes, you would. Yes, absolutely.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
And particularly with heat pump, and that seems to be the perfect match at the moment because heat pumps use so much less. But I'm in the middle of my own heat pump replacement project at the moment at home, and it is certainly, it's a $3,000 outlay, which is going to be too costly for a large group. And there are some, certainly you can spend anywhere from a few $100s with the rebate programs to a few $1,000s, and is trying to figure out where in the middle of that is right for, you know, each individual home.
Has
So
the rebate come off? Because mine didn't cost anything like that.
Yes, it depends a lot which model you get, and there are units
okay.
that are priced a lot cheaper and can be installed for a few $100s potentially, or almost free under the government programs. The same rebates apply to more expensive systems, but there seems to be a lot that it's up in the $2,000 to $3,000 price range fully installed from my own research.
Thanks.
So there's a wide range of options out there depending on what you're looking for.
Yeah.
Emma, I see a question in the chat there from Ian about the case for home batteries. Oh, Ian, I'm very unprepared for the detail of that question. But the simple answer is there's still not a great financial case for a home battery, and despite you know, some people do it for a number of different reasons and maximizing their solar energy, but the pure financial benefits are still weak on a battery over the life of the battery. That's improving slowly, maybe a little bit slower than we thought, because the whole solar industry has seen prices rise for the first time in the last, perhaps the last 10 years, because of the tightness of the supply chain and conditions in the market. The cost of actually buying solar panels and some components has gone up slightly, which was slightly unexpected. We're on such a long downward trend in solar and battery systems in general. But what the project is looking at is, if not the case for individual batteries, that's the purpose of a neighborhood battery or a community battery, is to share the cost of that asset across a larger group of customers and take advantage of reducing that and maximizing the benefit. What's currently very difficult to do, if not impossible, with a home battery, is to participate in what's known as network services. So giving your battery, not that there aren't pilots and trials, but generally speaking, a virtual power plant is one of the few things you can enroll in with a battery, which is sharing your energy when a retailer is trying to work on the market and deal with the highs and lows of energy pricing. But what a community, a larger scale battery, neighborhood or community battery, can access is actually play in these FCAS, frequency control ancillary services markets, these secondary and tertiary markets that are giving benefits to the community of storing excess solar, benefits to the network business, to the electricity network, by managing peaks and troughs in the voltage and in the consumption throughout each day, and benefits to the broader market. FCAS is one example where if you respond really quickly, you can make, you know, there can be good financial incentives. And these are all of the inputs, and this is why it takes so long. When we're modeling a community battery, you're modeling a very complex mathematical equation that has about 30 different variables to look at. And it's trying to find the right combination of those variables that look right commercially, and ultimately trying to find someone who would partner that. So very much of our mind to find the case. Ian, to answer your question, is there a case for home batteries? Maybe, maybe not. It's a little weak generally speaking, but trying to find the right case for larger scale community batteries is very much what the project's looking at the moment for Heyfield, with the specific conditions in Heyfield. Oh, a follow-on question, Ian. Okay. Who would manage a community battery? And so if I go back a couple of slides, that's where we were talking about the community retailers and aggregators would be a big part of who operates the battery, or who manages it. The ownership model is a big part of our business stream. Ed Langham, who some of you may know is one of our project research team. Ed is responsible for taking the outputs of all the complex modeling and overlaying that with a business model. If you all, also some of us cast our mind back to our business model workshops that we conducted with the CRG, looking at who owns it, how do you get the investment, how do you make the money, what are those income streams, as well as who operates and maintains it long term. So yes, 30 variables that the research team is sifting through to try to find the right combination at the moment. 30 is just a broad number, just to give you a sense of scale, but it's not a 1 or 2 variable equation for sure.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Any other questions from anyone?
Oh, go on.
No, whoever that was, go for it.
So really then a community battery is not really viable unless you get it subsidised, is it? You know, like you get a grant for it, because the cost of installing it and the return on investment is probably not there at this stage.
It does seem to be a big part of the business case. I think you're right, Mike. We'll be looking at the raw cost to start with, and then overlaying things like the arena ramp funding as the most likely target of where the project goes, looks to leverage for an implementation. So this being the feasibility study and the future being the implementation project. But I think in simple terms, having access to some grant funding will take a lot of heat and difficulty be about what might be a very marginal business case. Yes. But more on that to come from the research team when we put the final numbers together. There's another question now. I thought, Emma, did we have another voice?
I actually had a question, because you've shared some information really around our percentage of renewable energy. I guess if we have limitation on exports into the system, how do we actually become more renewable? Is it purely around storage, storing the excess solar that we've got, or do we increase our amount of solar generation, or all of our other forms of renewable energy generation? How do we do that? There's quite a few. That's right. Yeah. Sorry, I get the comment there around. I think from Mike around Yakandanda. I mean, there's a number of community groups that Yakandanda has started, the Phillip Island as well. I mean, they're all aiming to be 100% renewable by 2030. I mean, that's a massive goal, given that I'm not even sure how you can successfully measure it to say that, yeah, we are 100% renewable in this town, because how do we start that? I'll stop talking and you can.
No, thank you. Yeah, no, I think I understand the core of the question, and it's a combination of most of those. I'd say the most costly piece that we've certainly tried to avoid in this project is massive upgrades to the poles and the wires to the electricity network. And the minute that starts happening, it's long cost, shared by the whole community, but that seems to be a piece of the equation that we absolutely have wanted to avoid, and thus increasing the renewable energy sources, the solar generation, where we add some biomass and other things, and having a place to store that energy means that we can, use it in the best time. It's a bit of again, that's to that theme of community retailer and aggregation and load flexibility, where we leverage some of the batteries that we've got, right? Particularly, again, in everybody's hot water system is a thermal battery. It just stores heat. And if we put renewable energy into that, well, suddenly we're not pulling that as coal energy overnight. So we're not there yet, but I think in simple terms, using the infrastructure we already have in the best way possible seems to be the best fundamental direction in terms of the renewable energy journey.
Okay, thank you.
It might just be from where Heyfield is at the moment that we need to add perhaps it's a small solar farm or something of that scale that doesn't trigger large upgrades, but that adds a lot more generation, because certainly the numbers that we're seeing, even just in general terms, if we scale it up, we're not 100%, the Heyfield community is not 100% renewable yet. And there'd be a fair bit of energy because there are of the large industrial customers is something we sort of need to exclude a little bit.
Yeah, okay, yeah, because obviously they need supplies of their own. Could you describe what a small solar farm is for those that may not be aware of, when we're talking scale?
Yeah, back to that scale slide. We've got some very large solar systems on a couple of key businesses in Heyfield, but they would be, 1/10 or 1% or less of the size of a solar farm. Can't think of the numbers off the top of my head. I think there's a 70 odd megawatt solar farm going in near Glengarry as a somewhat local example, not related to our project and just going in as a commercial solar farm. But in essence, a solar farm in simple terms, is usually something that's in a small solar farm might be 0.5 megawatt, but a lot of solar farms sort of seem to be in the 1 to 10 megawatt range. They do take up quite a little bit of land. You can get some mega solar farms super big, but we know Heyfield's consumption, that's 17 gigawatt hours a day, and something in the order of, 1 to 3 megawatts would be quite doable. Could potentially go in the land on the Heyfield Mafra Road, all sorts of options. So something that would sit out in the paddocks on its own, a big field of solar panels, not necessarily as far as the eye could see, but a lot more than you'd ever put on a home or a business.
Yeah. Okay. All right then. Yeah, and there's Ian's just commented in the chat. 5 megawatts solar farm. It's small. Okay.
Yes, you're right. It looks you can scale to some of these projects are incredibly large. Tens and low hundreds of megawatts. But yes, perhaps not trying to build out Australia's biggest solar farm on the back door on the doorstep of Heyfield. But a point well made, Ian. Thank you.
Okay, just looking at some of the comments in the chat. So Yakandanda has been in the news quite a lot recently, and I think I have to say I've not been across the detail there, but I think they've got another webinar or something happening very soon about how they are edging further to being totally renewable. So we'll have to get some more information about that. Ian, grid forming or inertia inverters from a community battery, was that answering my question around how to get to renewable, being more renewable?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, could you describe maybe what that is, please?
Well, I'm sorry, I don't understand the question. What did you say?
Your comment around, sorry, I was asking about how do we get to being more renewable, and you put a comment in grid forming inertia inverters.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Yeah, that's another conversation. But basically, what lacks from solar and battery inverters feeding into the grid is the actual mechanism that allows the grid to function, and that's what's called inertia. So where previously solar farms and wind farms were pumping their solar and wind energy into the grid, none of them were grid forming. And what that means is it spins at the same rate as does the coal-fired power stations, so they actually synchronize. And that's a really basic step. The recent technology has allowed rather large inverters now to be grid forming. So what that says is if those inverters from those sources of energy can grid form, we don't need the coal-fired power stations.
Okay.
And Ian, to leverage that, the extension is, it's one of the challenges in a microgrid is having, if you were to separate from the main grid, which as we've looked at it through our project is incredibly hard to do because the broader Heyfield community that we wanted to include is quite large.
Yes.
But the fundamental problem you run into is you need grid forming assets, because what if the system stops and you need to restart that microgrid?
Yeah.
And you're right,
Yeah.
that technology is now very much the focus of the broader industry, as some grid projects with grid forming batteries are now starting to roll out as well. So
Absolutely.
yes, the technology capability has moved, whereas as you said, Ian, in the past a solar farm was simply slave to the coal.
Yeah, sadly, yes. No, that's good. Good question, Emma. Thanks.
No problem. Thanks for that. Sorry, Mary, looking at your comment, is the gasification easier for Heyfield than some other communities because it doesn't have town gas? I know that there are moves in some community buildings to remove their gas. For example, taking gas heaters out and putting in split systems. I guess it's just, well, I have a gas cooktop, so like a carbon terrace. And I think it's more about, it's one of those, like a kitchen is like a 10 to 20 year commitment in terms of the appliances that you put in. So whether it's possible to upgrade that or change that easily, I'm not sure. Yeah, I guess not having that sort of civil infrastructure means that it should technically be easy, but whether there's an appetite to do that or not, I guess it would be around the cost of power versus the cost of gas. And of course, it's bottled gas. I reckon bottled gas is quite expensive, but a lot of people probably don't look at it. I'm not sure. Maud, what do you think?
Oh, yeah, we have gas at home, and well, that's all we have is on gas. Though.
Yeah, for cooking.
So, and we only have a small, not as big as yours,
Yeah.
gas stove. So I don't know. It should be make me think.
We're talking.
I'd observe for Murray too, at least the benefit, if it's on bottled gas, it's a lot easier to stop buying bottles, whereas a lot of people seem to go through, a lot of effort to actually get their gas meter disconnected and removed when they're fully degasifying and removing themselves from the gas network in the major capital cities. So there's certainly one benefit there, that especially if it's feeding one appliance, you don't have to really worry about capping it, relatively easy to remove if you were wanting to replace it with a more modern electric appliance.
Yeah.
More flexible anyway.
Yeah, I think we were talking about this earlier, that if you're a single person moving into an apartment now, you actually don't need any kind of oven. You could be completely electric. IKEA do quite a nice small induction top that you can just purchase. There's air fryers, or you can be fully electrical in your kitchen. You wouldn't need gas at all. So it's certainly, the opportunity is certainly there. Okay, right, it is 8 o'clock. Does anybody have any more questions that they'd like to ask Tim or anybody else on the call, on the webinar? Speak now, forever hold your peace. Okay.
Until the next meeting.
Hello, pardon?
Until the next meeting, hold our peace.
Meeting, yeah, absolutely. All right, well, I would like to say thank you very much for all for attending. I know that it's been a small group, but we've had a good discussion. There's something being recorded, so it'll be uploaded to our YouTube channel and shared via social media. And obviously I'll send out another invite for our next webinar. Okay, thank you very much, Tim. Very good presentation.
Thank you for having me, Emma. Thank you, everyone.
Sure. Okay. Until next time.
Thanks, Emma. See you, Moors.
Cheers now.
Okay, thank you. See ya.